Hello and welcome to the third clip in the series of an introduction to social policy. In this clip I'm going to be looking at the development of social policy. Having had a look at what social policy covers and the wide range of concepts that come within that umbrella, the next stage is going to be how do we create or how do we develop social policy? As I've indicated right at the beginning, it's something that's been going on since the very early days of the written contract between government and its citizens. So to say social policy is created is sometimes a little bit of a misnomer, but I think it covers the idea that sometimes new ideas come forward that don't really tie in to what has been happening previously. So in that sense, we do have to think about social policies sometimes being created, sometimes being evolved, sometimes being a bit of a revolution going on, because sometimes we can have some quite massive changes in approach. And that would certainly be I think a commentator's view of what happened through the Thatcher and Major administrations, where we went from a welfare state driven delivery of services to one that was much more market orientated, with the state being a facilitator rather than a deliverer. So next few slides are going to be look at how do we develop social policy, how's it identified that changes are needed. Okay, so here I'm returning to a slide that I have used elsewhere and was developed to help students focus on what type of theories, what type of evidence they would be using in an assignment, and to help really understand the different types of knowledge, of propositional knowledge that we have, whether that be academic knowledge, whether it be knowledge as a result of studies, or whether it's actually a developing idea. Now, if I was being asked to talk to you about what sort of evidence I should be using in an assignment, I would be saying you should be focusing on academic knowledge and you should be focusing on empirical studies with appropriate weighting. But I'm not doing that today. I'm looking at it from the perspective of social policy, because actually by setting out knowledge in its different styles, you can also use it to explain how knowledge has started to be created. And by that I mean in terms of social policy. So with social policy, it often is starting on the right-hand side where ideas are developed. And these developing ideas come through people coming together. Traditionally, you might have groups of like-minded individuals getting together, putting ideas on the table, debating them, and coming up with ideas that they would believe makes a difference to society. Today, it's a lot more complicated than that. That actually the way that we develop ideas is often from a multiple of sources, whether it's blogs and social media, whether it's people's websites, people putting up think pieces on either magazine boards or across professional group networks. You're starting to get a range of different ideas. All of this often then feeds into campaigning pieces, and you have the big charities, whether it's the NSPCC, Action for Children, or in adult services, the likes of Rethink or MenCap. You've got a range of different organisations that seek to influence policy, and ultimately will often find ideas that transition across their particular areas of interest, and that then starts creating a pressure on policy making that says these changes actually have more than an interest to a small group, they're of interest to a wider society, and therefore need to be considered. And I would argue that having started discussions around personal budgets and direct payments around a small number of people with physical disabilities, they were ideas that between the early 90s to now have gained greater currency and ended up becoming mainstream policy. You then have empirical studies, and this is where you start seeing government and organisations responding to those developing ideas. So government might present statistical reports with recommendations for action. They might present departmental reports or practice reviews which start bringing all of that together and saying this is the new direction of travel we need to be investigating, and that might then become green papers, it might be consultations that are then intended to influence future policy development. So it is a continuum. You don't go from I've got an idea, let's have a government report. These things are often much more nuanced. It's often a question of getting the right people and the right time and the right publicity and the right audience amongst policymakers. It's all a bit of a dark art, which is why you then have these think tanks who are doing their best to help focus the debate in a way that results in positive change. Having said that, all these think tanks have their own individual values, expectations and philosophies. So you need to be aware that in any of this you are critically evaluating what you are seeing and where it is coming from. From the earlier slides, I think this one is now quite obvious in that there is a recognition that social policy is constantly evolving. As I indicated, occasionally you get ideas that are totally new or quite revolutionary to the direction of travel, but often it's a process of evolution. Changes can be the result of political change, so a change in the party in government, or potentially less likely, but the approach that an opposition party might be taking subtly changes the nuances and the level of common change with the governing party. There's often public awareness has an impact. So in the last 10 years in the UK, I would argue that the awareness of mental health needs has changed quite drastically and has resulted in very definite changes in government policy and the social awareness that goes alongside it. And I'm beginning to see some of that as well in terms of the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matters also having an impact. So public awareness is something that can be seen and almost can be measured. There are community challenges. So you may find a community of interest or a community of area that says, I need a change. And we've seen that around the idea of the northern powerhouse, saying the north is being left behind. But policy is also changing as a result of developing technology. If you'd have asked me to write this lecture 20 years ago, I would have possibly put that in, I might not. Now, technology is having such an impact on social policy, it has to be in there. Social policy is also changing as a result of social wealth, and as we see the inequalities in society between the 1970s, 1980s to the 2020s, you see a very marked increase in the discrepancies between those that run large companies and those that are working for them. That will need addressing at some point, because as Durkheim suggests, it can result in social breakdown. So people are aware of it. At this stage, I don't see that there is a policy to address it, just a few occasional statements. And ultimately, society does change over time. And I think what we're seeing in 2020, 2021, as a result of the pandemic, there have been some real major shifts in society, not least of which those that are able to work from home are getting an appetite for it. And I think the idea that we will go back to a industrial approach to the workplace is probably now over. That debate is finished. What we're now going to have to investigate is, how does society adapt to the new model? So that then demands a social policy approach. So, having been considering how social policy comes about, the next clip is going to start looking at some of the mechanics behind how social policy happens. So the various social levers that we have available to us that feeds into the development and evolution of social policy within our community.